Okay, good afternoon. We're gonna get started here. I'm pretty sure people will still join the seminar as we go. And so it's already 3:05 Central Time here in the US. So I'm gonna get started. Um, so today I have the great honor to present Mr. Geoffrey Marshall um, from the Water Resources Authority of Jamaica. Um, I was talking to him just a few minutes ago, and I think it's great to have Caribbean participation. We are trying to combine the two communities, the Latin American community and the Caribbean community. Of course, due to the language barriers, sometimes we don't really merge fully, but we are trying to actually connect the two communities in terms of tracer hydrology or studies, opportunities, etc. So Geoffrey Marshall is a hydrologist by training who has worked in the water sector for over 27 years. Um, he attended the Washington and Lee Universities in Lewiston, Virginia, where he graduated with 2 degrees, Bachelor in Science in Geology and a Bachelor of Arts in Computer Science. Then he attended the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology in Socorro, New Mexico, and he obtained a master's degree there in hydrology. And then in 2006, he returned to Jamaica and rejoined the Water Resources Authority as a hydrologist since starting in March 2006. Since that time, he has served as a hydrologist in the planning and investigation units, and then as a senior hydrogeologist in charge of the permits and license unit as well. And then chief hydrologist in charge of the planning and investigation units. And currently, he serves as the deputy managing director, overseeing the responsibility of the Water Resources Authority technical branch of Jamaica. And he's also a justice of the peace, a distinguished Toastmaster and trained mediator, working on restorative justice as a practitioner. So I think it's great to have somebody with a different expertise, somebody that has science expertise, but also the planning, the administration, and the politic expertise in dealing with water resources issues. So, Geoffrey, thank you for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for allowing me to be here, and thank you everyone for coming and listening. Before I start, I just wanted to speak a little bit, because you mentioned, Ricardo, the joining in the Caribbean. And I must give much credit to the International Atomic Energy Agency, who has done a lot to help us in the Caribbean begin to use isotope hydrology. Thus far, we've only been doing it mostly in project works in Jamaica with various agencies, and I know they're doing a regional project in Trinidad right now as well. It's my dream to see it being mainstream in our regular water resources monitoring agencies in our program, and I think that this participation will help us a lot with that, and I look forward to greater collaboration with you and your team as we continue to build out isotope hydrology in the Caribbean. All right, thanks much. Just let me deal with a few matters here. Give me a second, please. Okay, I'm back. I just had to turn off something. All right, I'll share my presentation at this time and we will begin. This presentation was previously done at the Scientific Research Council of Jamaica for their 31st Science and Technology Conference. And so I'm just representing the presentation here to you all. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, dokie. All right, thanks much. So the title of this presentation is Determining Potential Contamination Pathways for Groundwater and Surface Water in the Rio Bueno Sub-Watershed Management Unit. And this is a case study using isotope hydrology. So the contents of this presentation, I'll be talking about the background for the study, and then I'll describe the study area. I'll be looking at the diet trace results that were done in the study area, which provided the foundation For the isotope hydrology study that we did, I'll talk about our methodology, look at some of the results we had, and then talk about the preliminary conclusions, and then I'll be open for questions and answers thereafter. This presentation should take about maybe 30 minutes, more or less, if not shorter. So as a background, the Miocene karstic limestone aquifers in Jamaica store a substantial amount of our groundwater resources here in Jamaica. And these aquifers are very highly vulnerable to anthropogenic activities. They're susceptible to pollution impacts from surfactants and contaminants that would come in from garbage, solid waste, from farming, fertilizers, etc. Also from bauxite waste disposal, bauxite alumina production, disposal of caustic effluent, and many other things that will probably go into the aquifer and contaminate the water going out. In these aquifers, the groundwater fluxes usually follow complex subsurface karstic structures. You know, they're going in cracks, crevices, caves, different flow channels under the ground. And so it's not necessarily porous flow, but it's going through secondary permeability in the aquifer. And this often bypasses the surface divides. So you might, on the surface, you would think that there's a surface water boundary at this point where things are draining here and there, but you'd actually have to see where streams are draining in sinkholes, corners, and where those sinks actually pop up. And so the fluxes may be different from what you would expect from looking at the surface. And one prominent example of this in Jamaica is the Rio Bueno Sub-Watershed Management Unit. The picture you see here is an example of some of these karstic flows, because this is the headwaters of the Rio Bueno River, which is the main river in the watershed, and this is called Darnock Head. This is my colleague, Mr. Desmond Wellington, in the picture, and you can see the significant discharge from this blue hole coming up and forming the headwaters of this major river, which provides water for irrigation, hydropower generation, and also recreation and domestic usage. So a significant deterioration in ambient water quality in both groundwater and surface water, springs and rivers in the Rio Bueno sub-WMU suggests that there's a lot of impact from human activities in this region. And in that vein, if we can identify recharge areas, if we can identify the sinking and rising stream connections and groundwater flow travel times, that will be really crucial in water resources management, so we can know where we need to protect to ensure that the water quality is maintained. We can be able to limit activities in various areas, and be better able to see where recharge occurs and how the flows connect to each other. In that vein, the use of artificial dye tracers and stable isotope hydrology can help us to identify these connections. This picture that we see here, our colleague is Miss Natalie Hutchins, another hydrologist, and this is a National Water Commission source of drinking water, where you can see they abstract from the source with that abstraction point right here, the pipe coming up. And this is Matney Spring in the interior of the study area, and it's in a dry time, because normally the water would be up at the top, but you can see that due to the drought time, this was about in the March period in the dry season, the water level has dropped significantly. Even though the water is still reliable and it's there, you can see the drop in water level in that blue hole. This is the study area. If you can see Jamaica at the bottom, it might be a bit small, but this is the island of Jamaica at the bottom, and the study area is right in the north central portion of the island. And the Rio Bueno sub-WMU, this is based on the old WMU classification, because one of the reasons for this project as well was to determine whether or not this WMU should be subdivided into two smaller WMUs based on the actual flow connectivity. But all of this region is karstic in nature. It's all limestone karst with the significant caves and the sinkholes that are not necessarily mapped here, but we see that there are many different outflows and the different sample points. I'll be talking about the sample points in some slides further on. But the points you see here are the sample points which were used for the study. And generally speaking, you'll see the hydrostratigraphy on the next map. But what I want to show here is that this is the location, the general map, and then in this area here, this red boundary has been designated as a cockpit country protected area. It's a place of significant ecological, environmental, and cultural significance to Jamaica. And there was a lot of discussion and debate about what the boundaries for this should be. But these are the final boundaries which are set for protection, where there should be no mining or any form of extractive activity within these particular borders. And so that just sets a backdrop for the study area here. This is the hydrostratigraphy of the study area, showing the mapped faults in the region. So you can see that it's very well faulted. The light blue areas are classified as limestone aquifer. These are mostly of the Newport limestone, Swanswick and Troy limestones, which provide significant karsting in the region, which is why you see most, and the brown areas in the interior are volcanic clastics, which are classified as aquicludes that don't store water for wells. And most of the rainfall that falls here, the rain comes off as rivers. So you can see the rivers in the interior, which flow off and sink when they encounter the limestone. And then these sinking flows re-emerge at discharges at the bottom here, at the top rather, along the coast. And the prevailing theories at the time were that, based on the more impervious limestone, which is the Montpelier limestone here, classified as limestone aquiclude, at the north of the aquifer, limestone aquifer, that this provided ponding, which forced the water to come up as springs going onwards. And the research showed that this may be true for the rivers, but it wasn't true for the springs. And the isotope data will help us to see that as we go further along. But this is the hydrostratigraphy of the region. And in addition to the limestone aquifer and the limestone aquiclude and the basal volcanic aquiclude, we also have the coastal aquiclude, which is the lighter brown, and coastal aquifer, which is our raised reef marine formations. And most of the groundwater that's stored in this aquifer is impacted by salinity, and usually it's used by the drill wells there, and use it with a lot of treating of the water for desalination via reverse osmosis. What we did initially before we started the isotope investigation was to use dye traces. And so the dye tracing, for those who may not be aware, is injection of artificial dyes into sinking streams, such as dyes would include things like fluorescein, which is what I am using in this particular image. This injection, myself and Mr. Wellington, we were injecting fluorescein into Low River sink. I'll show which sink was Low River later on. So you can use fluorescein, rhodamine, eosine, and sulfurrhodamine B. The methodology that you pour the dye into the sinking streams, and when the dyes come out in the rising streams, these dyes will accumulate on charcoal receptors that you set at the different locations, and you routinely switch the receptors to check whether or not the dyes are accumulated on them. And once you've collected enough receptors, you would send those out to the laboratory for dye analysis. And wherever you injected the dye, if you see the dye collected on a receptor further down what you might have set, then you can confirm if there are two consecutive occurrences of the dye that you switch on those receptors, then that's a confirmed trace. And we have done dye trace activities currently from 2016 until the present time. We still are doing more investigations. Historically, the investigations had been done in the 1950s and 60s, but no follow-up had been done since then until we resumed checking for them in 2016. So in the study area, in the image that I showed, we were injecting at this sink right here, which is the Low River sink. And in the previous investigations for dye tracing have showed where these particular sinks, sink 1, 2, and 3, were confirmed from dye tracing to rise up at the headwaters of the Rio Bueno, which you saw in the first image a while ago. And we also did tracing at this particular sinks over here, and these came up at multiple risings on the coast. This is bottom river sink and Blue River sink over this side, and these came out at Pear Tree Bottom on this area, and they came out at Laughlin's Great River at this area, and also at Roaring River here, and some at Dunn's River. Roaring River here and Dunn's River here. However, we did not see any dyes appear at any of the springs that we had also set at that point in time. So which was strange to us, because we expected that the dyes would have come out not only at the big rivers, but at all of the different outflows in this region. So based on those outflows, which you see here in more detail, the confirmed traces that we had, with the 3 that came up at Darnock Head from these sinks, and then the other sinks that came up, some of them at these areas, others at other areas. Then we decided to do the isotope investigation to further see what were the recharge dynamics in this region that would explain why we only saw the dyes appear at the spring, at the big rivers, but not at the springs that we had thought that they would have come out at. So we looked at 46 sites in total in the region. The names are here. I won't read out all of them, but I will give the classifications that we had 3 rainfall stations, one in the interior at Mason River, one closer to the coast at Brownstown, and one pretty much on the coastline at Runaway Bay. So those are the 3 rainfall stations which set the local meteoric water lines for the project. We had 7 major rivers, which came from the dye trace results that we had selected, that we had done before rather, where 6 of these 7 rivers had one dye or another that came out in them, and these are major flows, like big rivers, well, big for Jamaica rivers. The exception is the St. Anne's Great River, which, despite its name, is actually a smaller spring. And we did not get to dye test it, but we decided to include it as a river site to see what the flows were for there. The sinking sites that we used are here as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sinks in the interior. All of these sinking sites were used as dye trace injection sites in the past. All of these 5 springs were used for dye trace injections at one point for one dye trace investigation or others in the past. And then on that, then we had 16 springs, which you see as the asterisks. Those are the springs that we measured, that we used as sites. And one spring, McDowell Spring, we utilized it as a spring at the initial part of the study. And then during the study, when we did another dye trace, we realized that this spring was also a sinking source. And so we utilized it as a sink for our subsequent dye trace investigation. So it is both a spring source and a sink source for this project, in terms of keeping aware of how this data would be interpreted for the other sites. And finally, we also had 15 groundwater sample sites, which are the orange dots. All of these are wells which were pumping. They're licensed wells. Some of them are industrial wells. Some of them are industrial in terms of being used by bauxite. Some of them are water production wells for public supply from the National Water Commission. And some of them are private wells used for livestock irrigation or for personal domestic use or for tourist usage. But all of these are active pumping wells. So in our methodology, we collected 677 stable isotope samples from all 46 of these sites. And these were collected from March 2021 to July 2023. And the 4 sites, again, we had well sites, as you see here. You have our chief hydrologist, Mr. Dia Ramsugun, showing the rainfall collector site that we had at Mason River. Then we have the sinking site. This is the Blue River Sink, where we're collecting the sample here. And the spring sites, I think this is Carmel Spring, that we're collecting the sample at for this spring site. And those are the 5 of the sites that we used: the wells, the rivers, and we saw the river site already with the Rio Bueno. We also collected tritium samples for the Basin River Rainfall Station and from 8 other sites for May 2023 to get an idea of the recharge, the age of the water from that. And we collected water quality data over 6 campaigns over the period as well. In addition to that, we also collected measurements during Tropical Storm Grace. Those were collected by myself in Kingston. And the data from Tropical Storm Grace shows up very significantly in the results that we have right here. This data I had shared with Ricardo initially through our contact Aurel Persoy, and that's how that's why I'm here to give the presentation, because that's how I got involved with Ricardo in providing this contribution to his paper that dealt with storm isotopes. Some of the constraints that we had in terms of the impacts of Tropical Storm Grace, we had limited data collection from the certain sites due to the hazardous conditions. The Grace came in the first part of August, and when we went out to collect samples, there was still flooding in regions, roads were still blocked, and so it was not safe to collect all the data. So we didn't collect all the data that we would have wanted to, but the data that we did collect provided very important feedback to the project. We had some challenges with access and team availability. Sometimes we had to cancel some campaigns because things happened with persons in the field. And then there were some project funding challenges where we had collected about over 1,000 samples. We analyzed 667, but we had about 445 samples left to be analyzed that were collected for the period June 2022 to July 2023. However, we were able to find in recent times, in the beginning of this year, we're able to find funding to do those final samples, and we're looking forward to the results of these samples to be analyzed by the second quarter of this year, as in sometime in between July and September. We'd expect to get these sample results, which would further inform the results that I'm presenting right now. But we have enough to present, but these samples will also provide some more data to further strengthen the conclusions that we are going to present today. One sample site that we had at Windsor Spring, these samples were impacted by high organic content. This spring is it's like a mineral spring that has a very high organic content. It's known for being able to, you can actually light the spring on fire because there's a lot of methane and other petroleum impacts on the spring, naturally speaking. And so while we have not been able to identify if there's oil there per se, the samples that we had were not able to get any isotope data, unfortunately, from that. We couldn't use that sample start. So that data, those data were discarded for use of analysis. And the IAEA had recommended that we consider the volume of precipitation on the per mil values, and we're going to look at that in the final report of the preparation when we prepare the data to see how volume precipitation might impact the per mil values for oxygen and hydrogen. So these are the meteoric water lines which we had developed from the 3 rainfall stations, and they're all very similar when compared to each other and the global meteoric water line. There's some differences, but they're still very similar in a general sense. And you can see the meteoric water line calculations that were developed and the R-square values for them to show that they're all pretty consistent. And one thing of note is that the tropical storm Grace values significantly impacted all of these. You can see the high depletion of those values down at the bottom here for Mason River, for Brownstone, and even for Runaway Bay. But these values that you see on the bottom here from away from the pack, these are the impacts that we saw from Tropical Storm Grace. And based on the locations of the sample sites, the Mason River waterline was chosen as the local meteoric waterline that all of the results would have been compared to. And that would be the green line here, which is a little bit above, parallel to the global meteoric waterline. Looking at the time series for the rainfall stations of 2018, we can see the clear impact of Tropical Storm Grace in August 2021. The trends generally followed each other in a general way. You can see for Mason River, Brownstone, and Runaway Bay. And the impact of altitude on the Tropical Storm Grace values are also seen here, where the most depleted values were for the Basin River site, dropping to below 12 per mil for oxygen 18. And then for closer to the coast was the Brownstone source rainfall station, which is about 10 per mil, minus 10 per mil, I should say. And then the Runaway Bay, which was right on the coastline, about 40 meters from the coastline, had the lowest of the tropical storm Grace values at about minus 5 per mil, but it was still the lowest, one of the lowest values that it had there. And so that altitudinal impact showed up, so to speak, in those values. And see the general trend very similar, except for the tropical storm Grace indication, the general tropical storm Grace impact. And the high precipitation of this time here, this is in our rainy season in October, where it didn't come up as much for the altitudinal impact, because this was a more of a single event, while this is a more cumulative event over the entire month. So that's why the values are more similar, even though they had higher precipitation at that point in time. But the general trend was similar for all the rainfall stations over the time period. For the measured rivers, again, you can see some impact of tropical storm Grace. We saw that the Darnock and Laughlands rivers showed more variation from rainfall. More than likely, the rainfall contribution showed up more there, while Roaring River, Pear Tree Bottom, Duns River, and Cave River are more groundwater-fed streams, and the impact of rainfall on those may not be as great. The Pear Tree Bottom showed a strong impact from Tropical Storm Grace, but were not able to collect samples from the other rivers during August 2021 because rivers were in spate and it would have been hazardous to collect the samples at that point in time. We saw where St. Anne's Great River is very much different from the other river sources. St. Anne's Great River generally was at a higher per mil value, or lower, no, higher, in terms of less depletion compared to the other sites. So St. Anne is like about minus 2.9 per mil, while all the others were in the minus 3.5 to minus 3.9 per mil when they started off. And St. Anne's Great River consistently trends above the values of the other sites, so that indicates that its source is significantly different from the sources of the other rivers. And it reflects more of the water similar to the spring sources than to the groundwater discharge river sources. For the sinks, the 5 sinks that we had, there was very variable. So we didn't see much of a pattern. We had proved that McDowell was a sinking source in 2023, so it's included here. And that was the most depleted source of the sinks in terms of McDowell Spring. And the values that we had for the Blue River sink were much higher than we expected. And I'm not quite sure why that is. That's a topic for further investigation. It might be something about evaporation or the flow coming from the wetlands that are there, the inland wetlands. So that might be more depleted, more enriched, I should say. But that's one surprising feedback that we didn't expect for that source. For the springs that we measured, you can see the gap in terms of the data that we collected, because we collected all the data, but when we spoke about some of the samples that were not analyzed, the springs were some of those that we stopped in June 2022, and only one spring we continued to monitor. We submitted for analysis rather up over the period, but we're hoping to get all the other data analyzed this year. So the impacts of Tropical Storm Grace seem to follow an altitude pattern, where Gyp Spring, which is on the interior, was the highest altitude spring, and it had the most depletion during Tropical Storm Grace. And Cool Shade Spring, which is closer to the coast, showed the lowest impact of that. And there was the most variation appeared to be from the Blue Hole source, but the spring 018 values seem to be very consistent over time. And the lowest values, the most depleted values, came from 2 springs in the interior, which are the McDowell Spring and the Pasture Spring. The wells were almost all very stable, not much movement back and forth, and there wasn't any observed impact of Tropical Storm Grace on those wells for the most time. The most variation was with the Long Pond well, which we know to be a well that is most likely tapping a conduit source, and we've seen contamination issues with that source from nearby sinkholes as well, so we expected that particular one. But most of the other wells seem to be stable groundwater that does not respond rapidly to rainfall, and we're going to see that in a bit as well. When we compared the meteoric waterline, we saw a clear distinction between the comparison of 018 versus deuterium over the period for the average values, and you can see that the rivers on a whole were the most depleted. The wells appear to have a mixture of the rivers and the spring discharges. The wells, the smoke wells, and then the sinks were more enriched compared to the spring flows, the wells, and the rivers in terms of the mean discharges. And we also see here for the Mason River source that the average with Tropical Storm Grace was significantly significantly different from the average when you take out the impact of Tropical Storm Grace. And you see that difference of about 5 per mil between the two averages. So that difference was noted, and the clear impact of the different sources was also noted in how those came out. When we broke down the rivers themselves, we saw where most of the rivers cluster around in this vein. So the Darnock head, the big river, the head of the Rio Bueno, might have more contributions from the local meteoric rainfall because it plotted closest to the Mason River meteoric waterline, while the other major river sources were above that waterline, a bit more shades of water from a bit more arid source of some sort or the other. And that mixing may reflect an unknown source that might be recharged from major precipitation events like hurricanes. We see that the St. Anne's Great River is much different from the other river sources that are here. So that river is more of a spring than the river those rivers that flow from the other areas down here. For the sinks, we see that the bottom and the Blue River sink here, 1 and 2, might reflect a more humid source of water as they plot below the meter water line. And the other 3 sinks, the Cave, Quashi, and Low Rivers, were very similar in their values, reflecting the common origin of rainfall from the central inlier, while the McDowell Spring, which was revealed to be a sink as well as a spring later on, shows altitudinal impacts as the elevation that it's at and the fact that it's coming from a limestone aquifer. And so that might indicate that it's of a different provenance than other springs. Plus, it also showed a potential stronger impact from Tropical Storm Grace, as we were able to collect a sample for that source. And so that higher depletion would come from, might be influenced by the Tropical Storm Grace measurement that will be included in the average. For the springs that we include, that we analyzed, there are about 3 apparent groupings. So firstly, you had the grouping of McDowell and Pasture Spring at the depleted end, which were both inland, coming from limestone aquifers risings, and they're at a higher elevation, so they would reflect the most depletion. And then you have the Jip and McNee Springs, which are both close to the Mason River precipitation waterline and close to the station as well. So this would impact or show that most of the rainfall at that station reflects in the water that we see there. But every other spring, for the most part, reflects impacts from a more or less arid rainfall source. As you see, they all trend above the local metric water line for the Mason River source, except for Cool Shade, which is here, the Cool Shade Spring. And the Bengal Spring is a saline source. That was another mineral spring, and that's more impacted by seawater, so that we can see where it plots below the line. But if you were to take away the Tropical Storm Grace measurement for the Cool Shade Spring, which is close to the line, then this would actually plot along this line up here, more than the line that we see up here. And when you include the St. Anne's Great River, that's this line right here, and it falls in group 3, which is different from the bigger rivers which are down on this side. The wells were also about 3 apparent groupings, where you had the more depleted ones, Alderton and Claremont in the interior and the east of the study area. And then you had the wells coming drilled in the limestone aquiclude area going through, and those were slightly above the local metric water line. And then the other clusters are higher up, which were looking at various ones which are closer to the coastline. So these are the 3 apparent groupings that we had. And one of the things we need to do is to look at the lithology and see, okay, what similarities do these wells have? Because the locations are a bit different, but the grouping that we see is very clear, and it's important to see now how this may be contributed, what's the recharge issues here. All right. And looking at the dye traces that we had done, the confirmed dye tracing, we saw that for the Rio Bueno dye trace we did, and the sinking and the confirmed rising, the Del 18 values for the Quashi, Low, and Cave River, compared to the major discharge at the Darnock Head and the more depleted mean, it's pretty clear that there's a large reservoir of groundwater that's the major flow contributor to the Darnock Head, and this may be recharged from normal rainfall, historical normal rainfall at a slower rate rather than major events. But the impact of Tropical Storm Grace on these mean values should not be discounted. Looking at the other dye trace that we did for the Blue River, where we did the sea injection in the Bottom River and Blue River sink at the top here, we see that there's a lot of potential mixing of the sinking sources that we have here. We're probably mixing with the waters that came from the McDowell Spring, because when we injected water at McDowell water came up at most of these sources as well. So you have the relatively enriched inflow contributions from these 2 rivers, and the more depleted contribution from this sinking source at McDowell Spring, and then you see the potential mixing along this line here, so that these rivers rising up here would be more than likely be coming from the mixing that we see here, plus the quote-unquote arid rainfall source that causes these values to plot above the local meteoric waterline. So that's an indication of the dye tracing contributions, plus other contributions reflected in the isotope values. And to further look at the impact of Tropical Storm Grace on the stable isotopes, we see the significant differences in the mean values for the rivers, sinks, and springs values, where the top value is the total average no, the top value is average before tropical storm Grace, and the lower value is the rivers after tropical storm Grace. So you can see the differences here between the rivers with tropical storm Grace and the rivers without tropical storm Grace and the rivers with tropical storm Grace, the springs with tropical storm Grace and the springs without tropical storm Grace up here, and the springs with tropical storm Grace below here, the sinks without tropical storm Grace way up here, and the sinks with tropical storm Grace way down here. But for the rainfall, for the well values, you see that there was very little variation at all between tropical storm Grace and between the values pre and post. So this shows here that tropical storm events will have a significant impact or appear to have a significant impact on rivers, sinks, and streams when it comes to recharge and impact on flow. But the tropical storm events, these major high intense precipitation events, don't seem to impact groundwater recharge. So we'll have to find out another way to see where does the groundwater recharge come from, because we can't rely on heavy rainfall from hurricanes to recharge the groundwater. So the conclusions thus far from the project, when we get the further data to analyze, we'll be able to refine this more. But what we've concluded thus far is that on average, there's a clear isotopic distinction between rivers, sinks, springs, and well sources as we sampled them. And the local meteoric water lines are similar for the three rainfall stations, but they do reflect the impact of elevation on the isotopic fractionation for heavy precipitation as seen with tropical storm Grace. And while rainfall and stream flow from the interior provides recharge for the sinks, as we know and saw with dye tracing, the recharge precipitation from springs, wells, and rivers may come from a different rainfall source that may be more arid in nature, and that rainfall would not necessarily be the same rain that falls on the interior that sinks into the aquifer. Groundwater recharge in this WMU basin may not be as rapid as we previously expected, as we've seen the observed low response tropical storm Grace. Conduit flow most likely goes right through the aquifer as seen in dye tracing, and the dye trace flow like within 2 weeks it circulates through. And the sinking streams as traced in the Rio Bueno do not significantly impact its isotopic content, while the Blue River traces indicate significant mixing between the sinking sources and the rising sources that are there. And one thing that we expect to see as well, looking at the groundwater data that is yet to be analyzed, is a possibility that the impact of tropical storm Grace might have been lagged due to recharge time. But so we'll see if there's any changes in the values that the 13 months of data that we didn't analyze as yet, if those were impacted by tropical storm Grace. But at this stage, the recharge may be lower than expected. So we're going to have to look at how we issue licenses for groundwater abstraction, how we ensure that we can abstract groundwater sustainably, and more able to quantify where the groundwater recharge comes from so that we don't do any over abstraction and not assuming that rainfall will quickly recharge those aquifers. So we're looking forward to continuing further work in isotope data collection. We are not able to continue data collection for this particular project as it's been wrapped up and the report is sent to IAEA for their feedback. But we are looking forward to saying, having completed this, what more work can we do to either continue the sampling in a future sense, or to use these data to inform our management decisions going forward, which is the main plan for this. And this final picture that you see here is actually the Duns River, the world famous Duns River, upstream, way upstream of where you see those falls where the tourists go, but this is up in the forest reserve where we had a sampling point for it, and it's still beautiful up there as well. So thank you very much. I am available to answer any questions as you may have at this time.
Thank you, Geoffrey. It was actually great to see so much data coming together in Jamaica. Let's see if we have some questions from the people attending the seminar today. I do have some questions and comments, but let me see if somebody's raising the hand here.
All right. I see a question in the chat. How long it took for the dye to reach the rivers, springs, and wells? Yeah, for the Rio Bueno trace, that took about a week, actually. We were surprised that took about a week. And the other ones took about about 10 days to 2 weeks or so, if off the top of my head. One thing we noted for the second trace was that there were some times when we repeated the trace, the dye came up for shore during one investigation, but for another investigation, we expected the dye to reemerge at, say, Dunn's River, and it didn't reemerge there. So what we figured is that the flow paths are very divergent, and we'd have to inject a whole lot of dye to ensure that all the spreading or everywhere that it goes might come up. Because as you know, once you inject it, the volume you inject kind of will impact how much pops up at the place you're expected to do. But the travel time was between 1 to 2 weeks from what we saw for the both sides.
Okay. Any other questions in the chat? Oh, well, I'm seeing the chat here. There are no other questions, but maybe Saida is okay. She's saying thank you. Any other questions? So the land use from the sinks to the coast, what is the land use in between?
The land use, it varies. In that region, there's bauxite mining, so they have some areas where the topsoil has been removed, and it's open air like that. There is forest reserves where the land has been preserved, and so you shall have some protection there. There's places where people are living, highly disturbed, enough subsistence farming, etc. And then there's some urbanization on the northern coast where you have most of the bigger cities. This region is very much ready for development, and there are many people moving there for development and stuff. So a lot of residential developments coming up on the coastline, a lot of tourist developments happening there, hotels, villas, that kind of thing. But it's a mixed bag of development from, like I said, mining, subsistence farming, minor settlements, and forest reserves all over the place, in that vein.
Okay, there is another question here I was talking about that because sometimes you have return flows, and those return flows will have a quite distinct isotopic signature that can actually mix and can actually make those dual plots quite difficult to understand. And sometimes you get some values that are something that you were not expecting, and recharge through the soils, depending on the ambient conditions, can actually change the isotopic composition. It can get more enriched than precipitation. So sometimes we compare our recharge with precipitation, and that's okay if the recharge is happening really quick, and there is really direct recharge. But if the recharge is taking some time and there is some time for re-evaporation and changing and mixing, then the signature of the precipitation is not anymore useful. We need to look into the medium part to see which one is actually the real signature that is actually getting into the to the aquifer, and that's tricky. Sometimes we need to use, for example, signatures from measurements from soils. That's something that we do quite often. We measure signatures from the soil to see if they actually compare to precipitation or not. But anyway, we have another question here. People is asking if you talk about sampling other areas outside that particular region and to see if the dye reach other regions, or did anybody mention, okay, we were able to see the dye outside that area at all?
To a degree, because the dye tracing we did was based on historical studies. So what we had done was where we looked at where it had historically been traced or area, we both injected to test the historical tracing and also to look at places that the historical tracing did not test. So that's how we had done injection there. The first study we did verified that the dye did not come, the dye that we injected at, say, Cave River came out for sure at Rio Bueno, but did not come out at Pear Tree Bottom or the other side, or the other sources there. So that gave us that first delineation to say, okay, there's a difference, that's right there. We did do those within the study area beforehand, and due to budgetary constraints, we couldn't do too many controls outside, but we are planning to do some more further dye tracing to confirm those studies. We tried to do the basic investigation before, saying based on what we know for sure, it would not expect to be coming out in this place and that place. So we did some studies there like that way.
Sure. So another question here related to the water quality. I guess Cordelia Samuels is asking if there is any evolution in the water quality from the sinks to the final outlet.
Yes.
Is the water quality indicating the same source or some mixing at all?
The water quality indicated gave some further clarity to the situation. I didn't put it in this presentation, but I put it in the final review, that report that we did. We had the constraint that we only had about 6 sample campaigns for water quality that we could have compared. And so from that, we're able to identify that there were some similarities between some of the sources. I couldn't tell you offhand right now what they were, but for future presentations, once the report has been reviewed and accepted, I can include that in further presentations. But it wasn't ready at this time to put in this particular presentation.
Cool. And well, I have another question. Is the tritium, do you have already the tritium results, and the tritium is indicating any evolution in the age at all?
The tritium that we got the tritium results, yes. I'd have to look it up to see. Let me see if I can find a picture of what it said, so I can share it. Because
Are the compositions of the tritium unit maybe between 1 and 2, I guess, something like that?
they're all between. I'm gonna share the screen I have right here so you can see
Okay,
it.
all right.
If I can share window. Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we took only about 9 samples of tritium mostly from groundwater sources. And these are the average of the values that we saw. So all of these are tritium units. So the rainfall station and Basin River was 1.025 TU.
Yeah.
The Jib Spring was about 0.58. And then the other wells we had here, 0.25 Brownstone, which is a very deep well. So it had a very low TI value. This well and these other wells, 0.13, 0.19, 0.54, 0.52, 0.46. So we basically assume that the groundwater, the lower ones, was older than the ones with the higher value. But beyond that, but why that would be, we weren't quite sure. And given the nature of these wells, we were a bit surprised that even though these are so close, the TU values were still lower here than here. So that's the results we have so far, and we're still trying to interpret them to see what exactly does this mean.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, just for curiosity, where are you submitting your samples for analysis? Are you still doing the analysis in Jamaica, or you're sending to a different regional lab?
The analysis were said. The analysis for these stable isotopes were done by Dr. Persoy or Aurel Persoy, in Romania. So we shipped them to him with the IAEA. So the IAEA engaged him as an expert, and so his lab did the analysis.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Great. All right. Well, I don't think that we have any other questions. I think this is a great study. It's a really, I mean, you have so much data. I'm pretty sure that you're going to refine these water flow paths and connections once you get the other piece of the data being analyzed. I think it's actually great to see that you were able to actually use the tropical storm grace compositions to also try to understand the system. I think those storms are quite unique because the compositions are quite different from the regular non-cyclonic isotopic composition. So you got like -12 per mil, and we use that in our paper. So I really appreciate you sharing that particular portion of the data as well. But I think this tropical storms can actually be used as a dye if you want to look in that way. When you have a lot of systematic sampling at the same time, they really help you to constrain those flow paths and connections and so forth. So I think they're quite useful for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we don't have any other questions. I really want to thank you again. I hope this is not going to be the last time. And please let me know if you want to share, or if you know anybody from the Caribbean region that want to share, preliminary results or any study they are conducting related to hydrology and tracers.
Definitely.
It would be quite welcome.
Most stuff.
All right. Well, we have another seminar in 2 months. I will be sending the announcement. It's going to be from Argentina this time, and I will let you know about it in maybe a couple of days. Have a good afternoon, and thank you for your participation today.